A struggling single father gave his last $10 and his late wife's winter coat to a freezing, homeless woman. He didn't ask for her name, and he never expected to see her again. But 3 weeks later, a fleet of black SUVs pulled up to his rundown apartment building. The men in tailored suits weren't there to evict him. They were high-powered corporate lawyers, and they brought a message from the woman he saved, a billionaire CEO who had just turned his entire world upside down. The wind howling off Lake Michigan in late January was a special kind of cruel. It didn't just make you cold. It felt like it was actively trying to break your bones. Samuel Grant pulled his collar up against his neck, his breath pluming in thick white clouds under the flickering neon sign of Carmichael's Diner. It was 2 a.m. The city of Chicago was buried under 6 inches of fresh snow, and the temperature had plummeted to a lethal -12 degrees. Samuel, a 34-year-old former diesel mechanic who had lost his garage during the economic downturn 2 years prior, was now working the graveyard shift. He was a man worn thin by grief and responsibility. After his wife, Nora, passed away from a sudden aneurysm 3 years ago, Samuel was left entirely alone to raise their daughter, Chloe. Every waking moment, every aching muscle, every drop of sweat he produced was for that little girl. But lately, no matter how hard he worked, the math just wasn't adding up. Carrying a heavy, leaking trash bag out to the alley dumpster. Samuel gritted his teeth against the biting wind. He tossed the bag into the metal bin, the loud crash echoing in the empty, ice-slicked alleyway. As he turned to rush back into the warm embrace of the diner's kitchen, a sudden movement in the shadows caught his eye. Huddled behind a stack of frozen, broken wooden pallets was a figure. Samuel paused, his boots crunching in the snow. "Hey!" he called out, his voice cautious. "You can't sleep out here, man. You won't wake up." The figure didn't respond, only pulling a thin, filthy blanket tighter around themselves. Samuel took a step closer, the dim yellow light from the back alley bulb revealing a woman. She was shivering so violently that her teeth were audibly chattering. Her clothes were a mismatched, tattered mess of damp cotton and ripped polyester, completely inadequate for the brutal Midwestern winter. Her face was smudged with soot and dirt, her hair a tangled, matted mess hiding her features. But what struck Samuel were her eyes when she finally looked up. They were piercingly sharp, an icy, intelligent blue, though currently clouded with exhaustion and terror. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely a rasp. "Just let me rest. If you rest here, you're going to freeze to death," Samuel said softly. He looked back at the diner's rear door. His manager, a hard-nosed man named Boyle, had strict rules about vagrants. But Samuel thought of Chloe. He thought of his late wife, Nora, and the relentless compassion she had always shown the world. "Come on," Samuel said, reaching out a thick, calloused hand. "Get up! I'm taking you inside." The woman flinched, shrinking back as if expecting a blow. The reaction broke Samuel's heart. "I'm not going to hurt you, I promise. I just want to get you warm." It took an agonizing minute, but she finally accepted his hand. Her fingers were like ice, stiff and trembling. Samuel led her through the back door, past the glaring eyes of the dishwasher, and into the quiet front of the diner. It was empty save for a sleeping truck driver in a corner booth. Samuel sat her down in booth 4, right next to the roaring radiator. "Stay here, soak up the heat," he instructed. Samuel went behind the counter and poured a massive mug of black coffee, stirring in 3 packets of sugar. He then went into the kitchen and ignored Boyle's scowling face. He grabbed a fresh plate, piled it high with hot meatloaf, steaming mashed potatoes, and drowned it all in thick brown gravy. He paid for it out of his own pocket, $10, exactly what he had set aside for his bus fare for the week. He would have to walk the 3 miles home in the snow. But looking at the starving woman, he didn't care. He placed the food in front of her. For a moment, she just stared at it, as if it were a mirage. Then she began to eat. She didn't eat like a feral animal, which surprised Samuel. Despite her ravenous hunger, she held her fork properly, chewing carefully, taking sips of the hot coffee in a measured, almost refined manner. "I'm Samuel," he said, wiping down the counter nearby to give her privacy while she ate. She paused, wiping her mouth with a paper napkin. "Madeleine," she said. Her voice was steadying, losing its rasp. "Well, Madeleine, you take your time. You can stay in this booth until my shift ends at 6 a.m. For the next 4 hours. Samuel worked, occasionally refilling her coffee. They didn't speak much. Madeleine mostly stared out the frosted window at the falling snow, lost in deep, heavy thoughts. When 6 a.m. rolled around, the morning manager arrived, and Samuel's shift was over. He walked over to booth 4. "I have to head out," he said gently. "The morning crew won't let you stay much longer, I'm afraid." Madeleine stood up. She looked marginally better, the color having returned to her pale cheeks. "You gave me your food," she said, her blue eyes locking onto his. "Why?" Samuel shrugged, a tired, honest gesture. "Because you were hungry, and it's cold." He looked at her thin, ripped jacket. Outside, the blizzard was only getting worse. Without overthinking it, Samuel opened his locker in the back. Hanging there was a heavy, dark green wool coat. It had been Nora's. Samuel kept it in his locker because the scent of her perfume still lingered faintly on the collar, bringing him comfort during the long, lonely nights. It was his most prized possession. He brought it out and held it toward Madeleine. "Take this." Madeleine's eyes widened, a flash of genuine shock breaking through her guarded expression. I can't take your coat." "It belonged to my wife," Samuel said, his voice thickening with emotion. "She passed a few years ago. She would be furious with me if I let you walk out into a blizzard without it. Please, take it." Madeleine reached out, her fingers brushing the thick, high-quality wool. She slipped it on. It swallowed her small frame, but the warmth was immediate. She looked at Samuel, and for a fleeting second, the broken, homeless facade dropped, and he saw an impossibly strong, commanding presence beneath it. "I will never forget this. Samuel Grant," she said, reading his full name off his diner name tag. Before he could say another word, she turned and walked out into the swirling white storm, the heavy green coat shielding her from the biting wind. Samuel watched her disappear into the snow, feeling a strange sense of finality. He zipped up his own thin jacket, braced himself for the freezing 3-mile walk home, and prepared to return to his difficult reality. The next 3 weeks of Samuel's life felt like a slow, suffocating descent into absolute darkness. The morning after, he fed Madeleine. Samuel arrived at his small, 2-room apartment in the South Side to find Chloe coughing violently. It wasn't her usual asthma wheeze. It was a deep, rattling cough that shook her tiny 7-year-old body. By noon, her fever had spiked to 103 degrees. Panic seizing his chest, Samuel wrapped her in blankets and carried her for 6 blocks to the nearest urgent care clinic. The diagnosis was severe bacterial pneumonia. The doctor, a sympathetic but overworked woman, handed Samuel a prescription for heavy-duty antibiotics and an inhaler. "She needs rest, warmth, and this medication immediately," the doctor advised. "If her breathing gets shallower, you bring her straight to the ER." Samuel rushed to the pharmacy, praying his debit card wouldn't decline. The total came to $185. Samuel's bank account held exactly $192. He swiped the card, holding his breath until the machine beeped with approval. He had the medicine, but he now had $7 to his name. Rent was due in 4 days. The financial ruin happened with terrifying speed. Samuel had to call out of work for 3 consecutive nights to sit by Chloe's bedside, applying cold compresses to her forehead and holding her hand while she struggled for breath in the damp, drafty apartment. When he finally returned to Carmichael's diner, Boyle fired him on the spot. "I run a business, Grant, not a charity for single dads." Boyle had sneered, tossing Samuel his final, meager paycheck. "I need reliability." Samuel walked home in a daze, the neon lights of the city blurring through the tears of frustration stinging his eyes. He had lost his job. His daughter was sick, and the wolf wasn't just at the door. It had broken it down. On the 5th of the month, the inevitable happened. Samuel's landlord, Mr. Henderson, a ruthless, impatient man who managed 50 slum properties in the city, banged his heavy fist against Samuel's peeling front door. "Grant, open up!" Henderson shouted. Samuel opened the door just a crack, keeping his voice low so as not to wake Chloe, who was finally sleeping soundly. "Mr. Henderson, please, I just need a week. I'm interviewing at a garage on 4th Street tomorrow. I'll have an advance." "I don't care about your sob stories." "Grant," Henderson snapped, shoving a piece of thick yellow paper into Samuel's chest. "You're 5 days late. This is a 7-day notice to quit. You have exactly 1 week to pay the $1,200 you owe me, or the sheriff comes and drags you and your kid out by your collars. Read it. 7 days. Henderson stomped down the hallway, leaving Samuel holding the eviction notice with trembling hands. The next 6 days were a blur of desperate humiliation. Samuel sold everything of value he owned. He sold his professional mechanic's tools to a pawn shop for a quarter of what they were worth. He sold his television. He sold the gold chain Nora had given him on their wedding day, crying silently as the pawnbroker weighed it on a cold metal scale. But even after stripping his life down to the bone, he only managed to scrape together $700. It wasn't enough. Every night, he sat by Chloe's bed in the dark. He hadn't paid the electricity bill, and the power had been cut. They were surviving on canned soup heated over a small camping stove. Chloe's health was improving, the antibiotics doing their job. But the environment was killing her recovery. The apartment was freezing. On the evening of the 6th day, Samuel hit his breaking point. He sat on the edge of the mattress, burying his face in his rough, calloused hands. The heavy silence of the dark apartment was crushing. He looked at the framed photograph of Nora sitting on the nightstand, illuminated only by the street lamp outside the window. "I'm sorry, Nora," he whispered, his voice cracking, tears finally spilling over and tracking down his hollow cheeks. "I failed. I tried so hard, but I failed her. I don't know what to do anymore." He had exhausted every option. The homeless shelters in the city were overflowing. There was a 3-week wait list just for a cot in a gymnasium. Tomorrow morning, the sheriff would arrive. He and Chloe would be out on the street, in the freezing Chicago winter. Samuel wondered if he would end up huddled behind a dumpster, just like the woman he had helped weeks ago. He found a bitter irony in the thought. He gave away his wife's coat to save a stranger, and now his own daughter was going to freeze. With a heavy heart, Samuel began to pack. He pulled out flattened cardboard boxes from the grocery store and started placing Chloe's clothes, her favorite stuffed bear, and their few remaining plates inside. He worked methodically, numbing his mind to the reality of what this packing meant. He didn't sleep that night. He just sat in the dark, watching watching the snow fall outside, waiting for the morning light and the dreaded knock of the authorities. Morning broke over Chicago with a harsh, glaring light. The clock on Samuel's battery-powered radio read 8:30 a.m. He had dressed Chloe in 3 layers of clothing, a thick beanie, and her winter boots. She sat on a sealed cardboard box, swinging her legs, blissfully unaware of the gravity of the situation. "Are we going on an adventure, Daddy?" she asked, her voice still a little raspy from the pneumonia, but her eyes bright. Samuel swallowed the massive lump in his throat. He forced a smile, though it felt like shattered glass. "Yeah, sweetie, a big adventure. We're going to go stay somewhere new for a little while." He didn't know where. A subway station, a 24-hour laundromat. His mind raced, calculating survival tactics for a homeless man with a child. At exactly 9 Chinekio and he heard it. The heavy, synchronized sound of footsteps on the creaky wooden stairs of the apartment building. But it wasn't the sloppy, dragging steps of Mr. Henderson, nor was it the heavy boots of a county sheriff. It sounded like multiple men, walking with crispy military precision. The footsteps stopped outside his door. Knock, knock, knock! The sound was sharp, authoritative, and demanded immediate attention. Samuel closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and stood up. "Stay here, Chloe," he murmured. He walked to the door, his heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird. He unlocked the deadbolt and slowly pulled the door open, bracing himself for the sight of badges and eviction papers. Instead, Samuel froze in utter confusion. Standing in the dimly lit, foul-smelling hallway were 3 men. They were dressed in immaculate, bespoke charcoal suits, heavy cashmere overcoats, and leather gloves. The man in the center, who appeared to be in his late 40s with sharp, intelligent eyes and silver-flecked hair, stepped forward. He looked entirely out of place in the slum hallway, like a shark swimming in a muddy puddle. "Samuel Grant?" the man asked. His voice was smooth, polished, and resonated with wealth. "Who's asking?" Samuel replied defensively, gripping the edge of the door. "If you're from the bank or debt collectors, I have nothing left. The sheriff is already on his way." The man reached into his coat and pulled out a sleek, matte black business card, handing it to Samuel. The gold foil lettering read, "Jonathan Reed, Senior Partner, Reed, Sterling and Vance." Wait, no Vance or Sterling allowed. The card read, "Jonathan Reed, Senior Partner, Reed and Associates, Corporate Litigation. I assure you, Mr. Grant, we are not debt collectors," Jonathan Reed said, his eyes scanning the barren, freezing apartment behind Samuel, taking in the cardboard boxes and the bundled-up child. "And the sheriff will not be coming. We took the liberty of paying Mr. Henderson the arrears on this property, plus a 6-month advance. Though frankly, this place is uninhabitable." Samuel's brain short-circuited. He stared at the lawyer, then down at the card. You paid my rent. Why? Who are you?" "I represent someone whose life you saved 21 days ago," Reed said, his tone softening just a fraction. "My client requires your immediate presence." "I haven't saved anyone," Samuel said, shaking his head. "Look, you have the wrong guy. I'm a mechanic. I was a cook. I don't know anyone who can afford guys like you." Jonathan Reed gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. January 14th, Carmichael's Diner. You fed a homeless woman meatloaf. You gave her a green wool coat. Samuel's breath hitched. He stepped back, his eyes widening. Madeline? The woman in the alley. She sent you. Yes, Reed said. He snapped his fingers, and one of the men behind him stepped forward, handing Reed a thick, leather-bound black dossier. I don't understand, Samuel stammered. Who is she? Did she win the lottery or something? Mr. Grant, Madeline is not a homeless woman, Reed explained, his voice dropping into a serious, confidential register. Her full name is Madeline Whitmore. She is the chief executive officer and majority shareholder of Whitmore Holdings, a multinational logistics and tech conglomerate worth approximately $4 billion. Samuel felt his knees go weak. He leaned heavily against the doorframe. A billionaire! But she was starving. She was freezing in a pile of garbage. Why was she in an alley? Jonathan Reed's expression turned grim, the polished corporate veneer cracking to reveal something dark and dangerous. Because 3 weeks ago, a highly orchestrated, hostile coup was initiated within her own company, spearheaded by her own flesh and blood, her younger brother, Gregory Whitmore. It wasn't just a boardroom takeover, Mr. Grant. It was an assassination attempt. Samuel stared in stunned silence. Chloe, sensing the tension, had hopped off her box and walked over, hugging Samuel's leg. Reed looked down at the little girl, his expression softening again before returning his piercing gaze to Samuel. Gregory fabricated evidence of massive corporate fraud, froze all of her personal and corporate assets simultaneously, and hired private contractors to ensure she never made it to a courtroom. Reed continued, his voice tight. Madeline narrowly escaped her penthouse with nothing but the clothes on her back. She spent 4 days on the streets of Chicago, hunted, freezing, and starving to death. If you had not brought her inside, if you had not fed her, and most importantly, if you had not given her that heavy coat to survive the blizzard that night, she would be dead, and Gregory would have won. My God, Samuel whispered, rubbing his face with his hands. Is she okay? She survived, Reed said simply. And over the last 3 weeks, operating from the shadows, she has managed to contact loyalists like myself. We have spent every hour since building the legal framework to destroy her brother and reclaim her empire. But before she makes her public return to sever the head of the snake, she had one very specific mandate. Reed held out the heavy black folder, along with a pristine silver keycard. She has been looking for you. Samuel, she knows about your firing. She knows about Chloe's pneumonia. She knows about the eviction. She knows everything. Reed pressed the folder into Samuel's chest. Ms. Whitmore requires your presence immediately. There is a black SUV idling downstairs. Pack whatever sentimental items you have left. The rest will be replaced. Samuel looked at the folder. Then, at the empty, freezing apartment that had been his prison of despair for weeks. Where are you taking us? Jonathan Reed adjusted his cashmere coat, his eyes glinting with a mix of respect and anticipation. To her estate in the Gold Coast. Mr. Grant, your life of struggling in the dark is over, but I must warn you. Stepping into that car means stepping into a war zone. Gregory Whitmore is about to realize his sister is still alive, and he will stop at nothing to fix his mistake. Samuel looked down at Chloe, who was clutching his leg, her big eyes looking up at him trustingly. He had promised her an adventure. He gripped the black folder, the leather smooth and heavy in his hands. Let's go, Samuel said. The transition from the freezing, decaying slums of the South Side to the opulent sanctuary of Chicago's Gold Coast felt like stepping through a portal into another dimension. Samuel sat rigid in the back of the armored Cadillac Escalade, the heavy doors sealing out the howl of the winter wind and the sirens of the city. The interior smelled of rich, untreated leather and expensive cologne. Chloe, exhausted by the morning's sudden upheaval, had almost immediately fallen asleep, her small head resting on Samuel's thigh. The heated seats radiated a soothing warmth that sank into Samuel's perpetually aching bones. He looked out the tinted, bullet-resistant glass as the bleak urban decay gave way to towering skyscrapers and eventually the sprawling, historic mansions bordering Lake Michigan. Jonathan Reed sat in the front passenger seat, silently scrolling through a tablet. Two men in tactical black suits occupied the driver's and rear-facing jump seats. The air was thick with unspoken tension. "Mr. Reed." Samuel finally broke the silence, his voice low so as not to wake his daughter. If Gregory Whitmore is as powerful as you say, and he's willing to kill his own sister, aren't we sitting ducks in a convoy like this?" Reed glanced back, a look of mild surprise crossing his sharp features. "A fair question, Mr. Grant. The vehicles are registered to a shell corporation 3 layers deep, completely unconnected to Whitmore Holdings. Furthermore, Gregory believes Madeline perished in the blizzard 3 weeks ago. He is currently focused on consolidating his power, not hunting ghosts." "Ghosts," Samuel repeated softly. "Is that what we are?" "For now," Reed replied, his eyes returning to the screen. "But ghosts can be very dangerous to the living." The convoy turned off the main avenue, approaching a set of towering, wrought-iron gates set into a 12-foot high stone wall. The gates didn't swing open. They slid back smoothly on hidden tracks, revealing an estate that looked less like a home and more like a modern fortress. The architecture was stark, brutalist concrete mixed with expansive walls of reinforced glass, perched dangerously close to the icy edge of the lake. As the SUV pulled into the subterranean garage, Samuel counted no less than 6 armed men patrolling the perimeter. They weren't wearing standard security uniforms. They wore subdued tactical gear, their eyes constantly scanning the tree line and the water. Samuel carried the sleeping Chloe inside, stepping from the cold garage into a cavernous, hyper-modern foyer. The floor was heated slate, and a massive, roaring fireplace dominated the central living space. "Samuel." The voice came from the top of the glass staircase. Samuel looked up, and his breath hitched. The woman descending the stairs bore absolutely zero resemblance to the freezing, broken vagrant he had pulled from the alley behind Carmichael's diner. Madeline Whitmore was a vision of terrifying, flawless authority. She wore a tailored, charcoal gray suit that screamed bespoke luxury, her blonde hair pulled back into a severe, elegant chignon. The soot and dirt were gone, revealing skin as pale and smooth as porcelain. But the eyes, those piercing, icy blue eyes, were exactly the same. However, it wasn't her transformation that made Samuel's chest tighten. It was what she held in her arms. Draped carefully over her forearm was Nora's heavy, dark green wool coat. Madeline reached the ground floor and stopped a few feet from him. Her gaze dropped to the sleeping child in his arms, her expression instantly softening. "Is she all right?" she asked, her voice losing its commanding edge. "She had pneumonia," Samuel said, holding Chloe a little tighter. "She's on antibiotics. The cold was making it worse. But she's breathing easier now." Madeline nodded slowly, her jaw clenching. "The cold. I know it well." She looked at Samuel, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made him want to step back. "Samuel Grant, you gave a ghost your last $10 and the most precious thing you owned. You saved my life." "You were freezing," Samuel replied simply, uncomfortable with the heavy gratitude. "I just did what anyone should have done." "No!" Madeline corrected him sharply. "You did what no one else did. Hundreds of people walked past me. They looked right through me. But you didn't. And because of that, I am still breathing. I promised I would never forget it. And I am a woman who keeps her promises. She gestured to a silver-haired man in a crisp uniform standing near the kitchen. This is Thomas, my head of staff. He will take you to your quarters. There is a pediatrician arriving in 20 minutes to examine your daughter. I've had a wardrobe prepared for both of you. Eat, rest, and let Thomas take care of everything. When you are ready, come to the West Wing. We have much to discuss. Ms. Whitmore, Samuel started, feeling entirely out of his depth. I don't need charity. I just need a job. If you could just point me toward a garage. Samuel, Madeline interrupted gently but firmly. The man who threw me to the wolves is currently dismantling my father's legacy. We are going to war. But before I burn Gregory to the ground, I am making sure the one person who showed me humanity is shielded from the blast radius. You are safe here. We will discuss your future later. Go be with your daughter. As Thomas led Samuel away, Samuel looked back. Madeline was carefully hanging Nora's green coat on a standalone mahogany rack in the center of the foyer, treating the worn garment with the reverence of a holy relic. For 3 days, Samuel lived in a state of surreal suspension. The guest suite he and Chloe occupied was larger than any apartment Samuel had ever rented. The bed linens felt like spun silk, and the private kitchen was stocked with more food than the diner had in its entire walk-in freezer. The pediatrician had arrived, examined Chloe, prescribed a new regimen of high-end medications, and declared she would make a full recovery. For the first time in years, Samuel saw the color return to his daughter's cheeks. She spent her days watching giant flat-screen televisions and being spoiled by Chef Thomas, who whipped up elaborate, sugar-dusted pastries specifically to hear her giggle. But Samuel couldn't relax. The tension in the estate was palpable. The west wing of the mansion had been converted into a command center. Dozens of monitors lined the walls, tracking stock fluctuations, news feeds, and security camera footage. Jonathan Reed and a team of high-powered corporate lawyers and security specialists moved frantically through the halls. On the 4th afternoon, Samuel felt useless. His hands, calloused and stained with years of motor oil, felt too clean. He wandered down to the subterranean garage to escape the suffocating luxury of the main house. The garage housed Madeline's fleet, 3 armored Escalades, a sleek Mercedes sedan, and an array of communication equipment. Harrison, the imposing chief of security, was pacing near the vehicles, barking into a headset. I don't care what the perimeter sensors say. Sweep the sector again. Gregory's lead fixer is Arthur Cole. Cole doesn't leave loose ends, and the fact that we haven't seen a whisper of him in a week makes me nervous. Harrison ripped the headset off, sighing heavily. Samuel stood near the lead Escalade, the same one that had picked him up. Out of habit, his eyes scanned the vehicle. As a mechanic, he didn't see a luxury car. He saw a machine, a puzzle of moving parts. He noticed a microscopic trail of dried, muddy slush behind the rear driver's side tire, near the exhaust manifold. That wasn't unusual for Chicago in winter. But what caught his eye was the way the plastic wheel well liner sat against the metal frame. It was off by perhaps 1/8 of an inch. A tiny, silver glint of a newly threaded screw peeked out from the dark plastic. Samuel frowned. He walked over, dropping to one knee. Hey, pal, back away from the vehicles, Harrison snapped, stepping toward him. This isn't a museum. Samuel ignored him, lying flat on his back on the cold concrete. He slid under the rear bumper, pulling a small pen light from his pocket. He shone the beam up into the dark cavity behind the tail light assembly. There, zip-tied to the wiring harness of the brake lights, was a small, black rectangular box. It had 2 wires clumsily spliced directly into the car's power feed. "You guys sweep these cars for bugs?" Samuel called out, his voice echoing under the chassis. Harrison scoffed. "Every 12 hours, top-of-the-line frequency scanners, military grade. We're dark." Samuel slid out from under the car, dusting off his jeans. He looked at Harrison. "Your scanners look for active radio frequencies, right?" "Obviously," Harrison said, narrowing his eyes. "Well, whoever wired that box up there isn't broadcasting a signal right now," Samuel said, pointing to the wheel well. "They spliced it into the brake light circuit. The tracker only powers on and sends a burst transmission when the driver hits the brakes. When the car is parked and off, it's a dead piece of plastic. Your scanners would never pick it up unless someone was sitting in the driver's seat, riding the brake pedal while you swept it." Harrison's face drained of color. He immediately dropped to the floor, shoving a flashlight up into the cavity. He let out a vicious string of curses. 10 minutes later, Madeline and Jonathan Reed were in the garage. Harrison had carefully extracted the device. "It's an analog burst transmitter," Harrison explained, his voice tight with embarrassment and anger. "Old school, cartel tactics. They must have slapped it on when Mr. Reed's driver stopped for gas 3 days ago before picking up Mr. Grant. They've been tracking our movements every time this vehicle hits a stoplight." "Does Gregory know where we are?" Madeline asked, her voice dangerously calm. "The transmitter's range is short, meant for tailing, not satellite tracking," Harrison replied. "But if Cole's men have receivers positioned around the city, they know the general grid. They know we're in the Gold Coast." Madeline turned to Samuel. She looked at his grease-stained hands. "You found this." "I know cars," Samuel shrugged, feeling the weight of the room's attention. "Your tech guys look for digital ghosts. I look for stripped screws and bad wiring." Jonathan Reed pushed his glasses up his nose. "Ms. Whitmore, if Arthur Cole is closing in on this grid, our timeline is compromised. We plan to wait until the quarterly review next Friday to file the injunctions. We can't wait. We have to strike now, before Cole narrows down the location and raids this compound." Madeline's eyes hardened into chips of blue ice. "Gregory is holding an emergency proxy vote tomorrow morning at Whitmore Tower to officially declare me deceased in absentia and liquidate the European shipping divisions. He thinks he's crossing the finish line." She turned to Harrison. "Can we get into the tower tomorrow?" Harrison shook his head grimly. "Impossible. Cole runs the building's security now. He has biometric scanners at the lobby doors, facial recognition in the elevators, and armed contractors in the lobby. If we roll up in these vehicles, they'll lock down the building and shoot us in the street before you get within 50 feet of the boardroom." Silence fell over the garage. The millions of dollars of security and legal power seemed suddenly useless against the brute force of a fortified skyscraper. Samuel looked at the crushed tracking device on the table, then up at the massive blueprint of Whitmore Tower displayed on one of Reed's tablets. He cleared his throat. "When I owned my garage, we had a commercial contract with an HVAC company," Samuel said slowly, stepping forward. "We serviced their heavy-duty utility vans. One of the buildings they regularly serviced was Whitmore Tower." Madeleine looked at him. Her interest piqued. "Go on." "The lobby is a fortress." "Sure," Samuel said, tracing a finger over the digital blueprint. "But commercial skyscrapers rely on a subterranean loading dock for trash removal, catering deliveries, and heavy maintenance. It's located in the sub-basement, accessible via an alley on 5th Street. Security down there is lax. It's just union workers and delivery drivers. More importantly, there's a heavy freight service elevator that bypasses the lobby entirely and runs straight up to the mechanical floors near the penthouse. Harrison crossed his arms. Cole isn't stupid. He'll have guards at the loading dock, too. Guards who are looking for a fleet of black SUVs or a tactical team. Samuel countered. They aren't looking for a beat-up white utility van. If we get a van, put on coveralls, and dummy up a work order for a ruptured boiler on the 50th floor, I can drive you right past the gate. Jonathan Reed looked at Samuel as if seeing him for the first time. It's a Trojan horse. It's insane, Harrison argued. Putting the CEO in a maintenance van if the biometric scanners on the freight elevator don't recognize her. I know how to hotwire a commercial Otis freight elevator. Samuel interrupted, a confident edge creeping into his voice. Mechanically, it's just relays and override switches. I can get us to the top floor. Madeleine stared at Samuel for a long, calculating moment. She saw the quiet competence in his eyes, the blue-collar pragmatism that had just saved them from an ambush. Do it, Madeleine ordered, turning to Reed. Procure a van tonight, forged work orders, uniforms. Madeleine, you cannot be serious, Reed protested. The risk is that my brother tears apart my company tomorrow morning, she snapped, her authority absolute. Samuel is right. They are looking for a billionaire's return. We will give them a blue-collar entrance. She looked back at Samuel. Are you willing to drive? Samuel thought of Chloe, sleeping safely upstairs. He thought of the eviction notice, the freezing apartment, and the sneer on his old boss's face. He was done being a victim. I'll drive, Samuel said, the morning of the proxy vote. A bitter, icy rain lashed against the windshield of the rusted white Ford Econoline van. Samuel gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He wore a stained blue canvas coverall with the name Frank stitched over the breast pocket. Beside him in the passenger seat sat Harrison, dressed similarly, a heavy wrench resting suspiciously across his lap to conceal the suppressed tactical pistol strapped to his thigh. In the windowless, rattling back of the van sat Jonathan Reed, clutching a briefcase packed with explosive legal injunctions. And Madeleine Whitmore. Madeleine was dressed not in a CEO's power suit, but in a baggy mechanic's uniform, a baseball cap pulled low over her eyes. Over the uniform, however, she wore Nora's green wool coat. She refused to leave it behind. Approaching the alley, Samuel murmured, turning the heavy wheel. The van groaned as it turned onto 5th Street, creeping toward the massive steel roll-up door of the Whitmore Tower loading dock. As predicted, 2 armed men in dark suits, Arthur Cole's contractors, were standing just inside the concrete overhang, holding assault rifles at the low ready. They held up a hand, signaling the van to stop. Samuel rolled down his window, letting the freezing rain blow in. He chewed aggressively on a toothpick, adopting the exhausted, irritated persona of a man who had been working for 12 hours. Engine off! Step out! One of the guards barked, shining a high-powered flashlight into Samuel's eyes. Buddy, it's freezing out here, and I got a ruptured steam valve on floor 54, Samuel grumbled, waving a clipboard with a forged work order out the window. If I don't get down there in 10 minutes, your entire executive floor is going to smell like boiled sewage. You want to explain that to the suits upstairs? The guard snatched the clipboard, his eyes scanning the document. Nobody called down about a steam valve. Call building maintenance. Then Samuel snapped back, leaning out the window. Call Jimmy in engineering. Tell him Frank's here. But while you're dialing, the pressure gauge is redlining. Let's go, pal. Clock's ticking. The guard hesitated. He looked at the rusted van, the exhausted blue-collar worker, and the incredibly authentic-looking grease stains on Samuel's face. The psychological trick worked. The guard's elite training was designed to spot assassins, not a grumpy plumber. He handed the clipboard back and slapped the door. "Go! Bay 4. Don't linger!" Yeah, Samuel muttered, rolling up the window and driving down the steep concrete ramp into the cavernous sub-basement. Incredible," Harrison whispered from the passenger seat. Letting out a breath he had been holding, Samuel navigated the labyrinth of concrete pillars until he found the heavy, yellow-painted doors of the main service elevator. He parked the van, killing the engine. "All right," Samuel said, looking back at Madeline. "Showtime!" They exited the van rapidly. The basement was loud, filled with the hum of generators and the clatter of garbage compactors. Samuel jogged to the elevator control panel. It was locked down, a red light glaring above a biometric thumb scanner. "Harrison, watch the ramp," Samuel ordered, falling back into his element. He pulled a multi-tool from his pocket, jammed the flathead screwdriver into the seam of the stainless steel panel, and popped the casing off. Inside was a mess of wires and a digital circuit board. 10 seconds. "Samuel," Reed said nervously, adjusting his glasses. "The proxy vote starts in 5 minutes. Samuel ignored the digital components completely. He traced the heavy power cables running to the mechanical relay at the bottom. He clamped his multi-tool onto the primary override wire, bridged it to the ground terminal, and sparked the connection. Clack! The red light turned green. The heavy steel doors groaned and slid open. "After you," Samuel said, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cold. The elevator ride up was agonizingly slow. The motor ground heavily, pulling them up 55 floors. Madeline stood perfectly still in the center of the car. She unzipped the mechanic's coveralls, stepping out of them to reveal a flawless, razor-sharp crimson suit beneath. She adjusted her collar, slipping Nora's green coat over her shoulders. She looked like an empress preparing for an execution. "Samuel," Madeline said softly, not taking her eyes off the elevator doors. "When these doors open, things will become violent. Stay behind, Harrison." "I'm right beside you," Samuel replied, standing his ground. Ding! Floor 55, the executive suite. The doors slid open, revealing a plush, carpeted hallway lined with mahogany panels. Standing directly in front of the elevator were 3 of Arthur Cole's elite guards, instantly alarmed by the unexpected arrival of the freight car. "Hey! You can't be!" one guard started. Reaching into his jacket, Harrison moved with terrifying speed. He stepped out of the elevator, driving the heavy steel wrench straight into the solar plexus of the first guard, simultaneously drawing his suppressed pistol and aiming it directly at the forehead of the second. "Hands away from your jackets!" Harrison growled, his voice echoing in the quiet luxury of the hallway. "On the floor, now!" The guards, seeing the cold, lethal intent in Harrison's eyes, slowly raised their hands and sank to their knees. Madeline stepped out of the elevator, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood border of the carpet. She didn't even look at the armed men on the floor. She walked with terrifying purpose down the hallway, toward the massive double oak doors of the central boardroom. Inside, the muffled voice of Gregory Whitmore could be heard echoing through the wood. "And while my sister's tragic passing is a blow to us all, Whitmore Holdings must look to the future. I move to officially finalize the liquidation of the European assets, transferring control to Quodsham." Madeline reached the doors. She didn't pause. She didn't knock. She placed both hands flat against the heavy oak and shoved them open with explosive force. The massive doors slammed against the walls with a sound like a thunderclap. Inside the boardroom, 20 of the most powerful executives and shareholders in the country froze. Sitting at the head of the long mahogany table was Gregory Whitmore, a handsome, slick man in his late 30s. Mid-sentence, his pen hovering over a stack of legal documents, Gregory looked up. His face, normally radiating arrogant confidence, instantly drained of all blood. He looked as if he were staring at a phantom. The pen slipped from his fingers, clattering loudly against the silent table. "Hello, Gregory," Madeline said, her voice dripping with venom, filling the dead silence of the room. "I believe there has been a slight miscalculation regarding my funeral arrangements." The silence in the executive boardroom of Whitmore Tower was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. It was the kind of silence that precedes a catastrophic explosion. 20 of Chicago's most ruthless corporate titans sat completely paralyzed, their eyes darting between the ghost standing in the doorway and the man sitting at the head of the mahogany table. Gregory Whitmore's face transformed from a mask of pristine arrogance to a canvas of sheer, unadulterated terror. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing against his silk tie. "Madeleine!" Gregory choked out, his voice cracking like a terrified child. We thought you were dead, frozen in a gutter, disposed of like yesterday's trash." Madeline stepped fully into the room, the heavy green wool coat draped over her shoulders like a queen's mantle. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her quiet wrath commanded all the oxygen in the room. "I'm afraid your contractors were as incompetent as your quarterly projections, Gregory." Robert Lawson, a senior board member with a thick shock of white hair and billions tied up in the company's European logistics, stood up so fast his leather chair crashed backward to the floor. "Madeline, good God, the police told us your penthouse was breached by a home invasion, that you were missing and presumed deceased. The police were fed a narrative crafted by my brother," Madeline said, her icy blue eyes locking onto Robert. "A narrative bought and paid for by liquidating the very assets you are sitting here preparing to sign away. Gregory didn't just stage a coup, gentlemen. He orchestrated a murder. Chaos erupted. Several board members began shouting at once. Gregory slammed his fists onto the table, panic making him reckless. "She's lying!" Gregory screamed, a vein bulging in his forehead. "She's having a psychotic break. Look at her. She's dressed like a vagrant. Security! Get security in here immediately! Arthur!" Jonathan Reed stepped out from behind Madeline, calmly opening his sleek black briefcase and dumping a mountain of files onto the polished mahogany. "That won't be necessary, Gregory," Reed stated, his voice carrying the lethal precision of a seasoned litigator. "I have here sworn affidavits, offshore bank transfers linking your personal accounts to the mercenary outfit that raided Ms. Whitmore's home, and the GPS tracking data of the assassins. Furthermore, I hold a federal injunction halting this proxy vote, signed by a district judge 20 minutes ago. The FBI is currently raiding your penthouse across town." Gregory's eyes darted wildly around the room, realizing the walls were closing in. The board members were physically backing away from him, repulsed and terrified of the legal fallout. Suddenly, the private executive door at the rear of the boardroom burst open. Arthur Cole, Gregory's head fixer, stepped through. He was a massive, scarred man in a tailored suit, but the professional veneer was gone. He held a matte black Glock 19, his eyes scanning the room, instantly assessing that the coup had failed. His gaze locked onto Madeline. If he was going down, he was going to finish the job he was paid for. "Madeline, get down!" Harrison roared from the doorway, drawing his weapon, but Cole was faster. He raised the pistol, aiming directly at Madeline's chest, before Cole could pull the trigger. Samuel moved. He hadn't stood idle by the doors. His eyes had been scanning the room with the same hyper-vigilant intuition that had spotted the car tracker. When the rear door clicked, Samuel was already sprinting. Samuel hit Cole like a freight train, just as the gun discharged. The bullet shattered the massive floor-to-ceiling window behind Madeline, raining tempered glass down onto the streets 55 floors below. The two men crashed into a heavy mahogany credenza, shattering crystal decanters and scattering files. Cole was a trained killer, lethal and precise, but Samuel was a diesel mechanic who had spent 15 years wrestling 600-pound engine blocks and surviving the brutal streets of the South Side. Adrenaline and raw, protective fury flooded Samuel's veins. Cole viciously elbowed Samuel in the ribs, a sickening crack echoing over the screams of the board members. Samuel grunted, tasting copper, but he refused to let go. He grabbed Cole by the lapels of his suit and drove him backward into the wall. Cole raised the gun again, pointing it at Samuel's face. Without hesitation, Samuel brought his heavy, steel-toed work boot down directly onto Cole's knee. The joint snapped with a wet crunch. Cole roared in agony, his aim faltering. Samuel capitalized instantly, swinging his grease-stained fist in a brutal, looping arc. His knuckles connected with Cole's jaw with the force of a sledgehammer. Cole's eyes rolled back, and he collapsed to the carpet, the Glock skittering away across the floor. Samuel stood over the unconscious mercenary, panting heavily, wiping a streak of blood from his split lip. He looked up. The entire boardroom was staring at him in stunned, horrified silence. Harrison stepped forward, kicking the weapon away and zip-tying Cole's wrists. Madeline hadn't flinched. She hadn't even ducked. She stood perfectly still, looking at Samuel with a profound, unreadable expression. Then, the wail of sirens pierced the tension. Through the shattered window, the flashing red and blue lights of 24 Chicago PD cruisers could be seen swarming the plaza below. Gregory Whitmore collapsed into his leather chair, burying his face in his hands, sobbing uncontrollably as the reality of his total destruction washed over him. Madeline turned to the terrified board of directors. She smoothed the lapels of the green wool coat. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice echoing in the ruined room. "The proxy vote is cancelled. Whitmore Holdings is officially back under my control. I suggest you all remain in your seats. The authorities will have many questions for you." She walked over to Samuel, pulling a pristine silk handkerchief from her pocket and gently offering it to him. "Are you all right, Samuel?" she asked quietly. Samuel dabbed his bleeding lip, looking at the crying billionaire in the chair and the unconscious assassin on the floor. He let out a breathless, exhausted chuckle. "I've had better Tuesdays," Samuel rasped. "But yeah, I'm good." The aftermath of the boardroom ambush was a whirlwind of legal firestorms and media frenzy. For the next 48 hours, the financial world was rocked by the arrest of Gregory Whitmore and the miraculous, cinematic return of Madeline Whitmore. News networks ran non-stop coverage of the botched coup, the embezzlement, and the sheer audacity of a billionaire surviving on the freezing streets of Chicago. But Samuel experienced none of this chaos. He was back at the Gold Coast estate, sequestered in the quiet luxury of the guest wing. A private physician had taped his bruised ribs and stitched his lip. Chloe was completely healed, her laughter echoing through the halls as she played hide-and-seek with Chef Thomas. Samuel, however, felt a deep, lingering restlessness. The war was won. His part in the story was over. It was time to figure out how to rebuild a normal life for his daughter. On the evening of the third day, Thomas knocked gently on Samuel's door. "Mr. Grant, Ms. Whitmore requests your presence in her study." Samuel followed the head of staff through the sprawling mansion. The study was a breathtaking room, lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and overlooking the dark, rolling waves of Lake Michigan. Madeline was sitting behind a massive oak desk, lit by the warm glow of a brass lamp. She looked exhausted, the adrenaline of the takeover having finally faded. But there was a deep sense of peace in her eyes. "Sit, Samuel," she said, gesturing to a leather armchair opposite her. Samuel sat cautiously, wincing slightly as his ribs flared. "Congratulations, Ms. Whitmore. I saw the news. Your brother is being held without bail. He will spend the rest of his life in federal prison," Madeline said coldly. "But that is not why I asked you here tonight." She picked up a thick manila folder from her desk. "Over the last few days, while my legal team dismantled Gregory's network, I had my private investigators look into you. I hope you don't mind." Samuel shifted uncomfortably. "There's not much to find. I fixed trucks. My wife died. I lost my business. End of story." "But it isn't the end of the story," Madeline said, opening the folder. "And it isn't the whole truth. Tell me, Samuel, 2 years ago, when you lost your garage on 12th Avenue, what exactly happened?" Samuel frowned, the painful memories surfacing. "The neighborhood went through a massive rent hike. Some corporate developer bought the entire block. They tripled my lease overnight. I couldn't afford it. So they seized the property and forced me into bankruptcy." "Why?" Madeline turned a document around and slid it across the desk. "Look at the name of the developer." Samuel leaned forward. At the top of the legal deed, printed in bold black ink, was the name. Oak Haven Developments. "I remember them," Samuel muttered. "Faceless suits. They tore down my garage and built a massive, automated shipping depot. Oak Haven Developments is a shell company." "Samuel," Madeline said softly. "It was wholly owned and operated by Gregory Whitmore. He was secretly acquiring land on the south side to build a shadow logistics network, siphoning Whitmore funds to do it. The man who drove you into bankruptcy, who forced you into that diner, who ultimately caused your eviction, was my brother." Samuel stared at the paper, his heart pounding in his chest. The universe felt suddenly, terrifyingly small. The cruel twists of fate that had broken his life apart hadn't been random bad luck. They were the collateral damage of billionaire greed. "My God," Samuel whispered. "He took everything from me." "He did," Madeline agreed, her voice laced with profound sorrow. "And because he broke you, you ended up in that alley on the exact night he tried to break me. The irony is almost cruel. Gregory created the very man who would ultimately save my life and destroy his empire." She closed the folder and rested her hands on top of it. I cannot give you back the years you suffered, Samuel. I cannot bring back your wife," Madeline continued, her eyes locking onto his with fierce determination. "But I can balance the scales." She opened a drawer and pulled out a heavy, leather-bound portfolio, placing it on the desk, next to a set of silver keys. "What is this?" Samuel asked. "This is the deed to a brand new 50,000 square foot commercial automotive and logistics facility on the west side," Madeline said. "Fully equipped with state-of-the-art machinery, 6 commercial bays, and a full staff currently awaiting management. It is entirely paid off, and it is in your name." Samuel's jaw dropped. He looked from the portfolio to Madeline, utterly speechless. "Furthermore," she added, handing him a contract, "Whitmore Holdings operates a fleet of over 4,000 commercial vehicles in the Midwest. Effective immediately, your new facility is the exclusive, contracted maintenance provider for my entire fleet. You will never have to worry about rent, medical bills, or your daughter's future again." Samuel's hands trembled as he touched the leather portfolio. It wasn't just a job. It was an empire of his own. It was a complete restoration of his dignity. multiplied by 1,000. Madeleine, I can't accept this. This is millions of dollars. Samuel stammered, tears stinging the corners of his eyes. I just gave you a plate of meatloaf and a coat. Madeleine stood up, walking around the desk. She placed a hand gently on Samuel's shoulder. You gave me your humanity when I had nothing left, she said fiercely. You risked your life in that boardroom for me. You are a good man, Samuel Grant. And in my world, good men are the rarest commodity of all. Take it, rebuild your life. Give Chloe the world she deserves. Samuel looked down at the keys. The crushing, suffocating weight that he had carried on his chest for 3 years. The fear of failing his daughter, the shame of poverty, finally shattered. He buried his face in his hands, weeping openly, the tears of a man who had finally found the shore after drowning for years. 6 months later, the brutal Chicago winter had long since surrendered to a bright, vibrant summer. The sun beat down over the freshly paved asphalt of Grant & Daughter Automotive, a massive, gleaming facility that buzzed with the sound of pneumatic drills and roaring diesel engines. Samuel stood on the catwalk of his glass-enclosed office overlooking the shop floor. He wore a clean, customized mechanic's shirt, his name embroidered over the pocket. The dark circles under his eyes were gone, replaced by the quiet confidence of a man who was exactly where he was supposed to be. His business was thriving. He employed 40 mechanics, offered them top-tier wages and health care, and ran the shop with the same blue-collar integrity he had always valued. Down below, Chloe was sitting at the receptionist's desk, drawing in a sketchbook. She was the picture of health, her cheeks rosy, wearing a private school uniform. She had just finished her first week at the most prestigious elementary school in Chicago, her tuition paid in full through a trust fund established by Aunt Madeleine. A sleek, black Mercedes sedan pulled into the main bay. The shop floor briefly quieted as the mechanics turned to look. Madeleine Whitmore stepped out of the car. She was dressed impeccably in a white summer suit, radiating power and grace. But as she saw Samuel descending the metal stairs, a warm, genuine smile broke across her face. "Samuel," she greeted him, accepting his firm handshake before pulling him into a brief, friendly hug. "Ms. Whitmore, good to see you," Samuel smiled. "To what do I owe the pleasure? Your fleet managers usually handle the drop-offs." I was in the neighborhood inspecting the new shipping hub," Madeleine said, looking around the pristine facility. "And I wanted to see how the boss was holding up. The place looks incredible. It runs like a dream," Samuel admitted, looking over the shop floor with pride. "Thanks to you." "Thanks to your hard work," she corrected him. Chloe spotted Madeleine and ran over, throwing her arms around the billionaire's waist. "Aunt Madeleine, look what I drew!" Madeleine knelt, uncaring about her pristine white suit touching the garage floor, and inspected the drawing. It was a picture of a giant green coat with a superhero cape attached to it. Madeleine's eyes softened, and she tapped Chloe on the nose. "It's beautiful, sweetheart. A true masterpiece." She stood back up, looking at Samuel. The bond between them was undeniable, forged in the freezing dark of an alley and hardened in the fire of a hostile takeover. They came from entirely different universes, yet they were forever tethered by a profound mutual respect. "There's something I wanted to show you," Madeleine said, her tone turning slightly more solemn. "Come to the car." Samuel followed her to the rear of the Mercedes. Madeleine popped the trunk, resting inside. Inside a sealed, museum-quality glass display case was Nora's heavy, dark green wool coat. It had been professionally cleaned and preserved. Mounted on a small brass plaque at the bottom of the case were the words, "True wealth is what we give when we have nothing left." In honor of Nora Grant. Samuel stared at the case, his breath catching in his throat. He reached out, his fingers tracing the glass over the coat. He could almost feel Nora's presence, not as a source of grief anymore, but as a beacon of immense pride. "I keep it in my office at the tower," Madeline said softly, standing beside him, "right behind my desk, every morning before I make a single decision regarding the thousands of lives under my employ. I look at that coat. It reminds me of the cold. It reminds me of what real strength looks like. I just wanted you to know that her legacy is safe." Samuel wiped a single, stray tear from his cheek. He looked at Madeline, seeing not the billionaire CEO, but the survivor he had pulled from the snow. "Thank you, Madeleine," he whispered. "For everything." "No, Samuel," she smiled, closing the trunk. "Thank you," as Madeline drove away, disappearing into the bustling Chicago traffic. Samuel walked back into his shop. He picked up his daughter, spinning her around as she giggled loudly, the sound echoing perfectly over the hum of the engines. He had lost everything to a winter storm, but out of the freezing dark, he had built an empire of light. Samuel's story proves that the universe has a mysterious way of balancing the scales. A $10 plate of food and an old winter coat didn't just save a billionaire's life, it dismantled a criminal empire, exposed a devastating betrayal, and completely rewrote the destiny of a struggling father and his little girl. True kindness is never wasted, even when given to those who seem entirely broken. If you loved this dramatic, real-life tale of redemption, loyalty, and ultimate justice, please smash that like button, share this video, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories that prove heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear mechanics' coveralls.